Machines with super-Turing capabilities were first introduced by Alan Turing, who investigated mathematical systems in which an oracle was available to compute a characteristic function of a possible non-computable set. The idea of oracles was to set up a scheme for investigating relative computation. Oracles are Turing machines with an additional tape, called the oracle tape, which contains the answers to some non-computable characteristic functions. An oracle machine is an abstract machine used to study decision problems. It can be visualized as a Turing machine with a black box called an oracle, which is able to determine certain decisions problems in a single step. However, Turing gave no indication on how such an oracle might be implemented. The Turing machine can write an input on its own tape and then tell the oracle to execute it. In a single step, the oracle computes its function, erases its input, and writes its output to the tape. It is possible to posit the existence of an oracle which computes a non-computable function, such as the answer to the halting problem or some equivalent. Interestingly, the halting problem still applies to such machines. That is, although they can determine whether particular Turing machines will halt on particular inputs, they cannot determine whether machines with equivalent halting oracles will themselves halt. This fact creates a hierarchy of machines according to their Turing degree, each one with a more powerful halting oracle and an even more difficult halting problem. With such a method, an infinite hierarchy of computational power can easily be constructed by positing the existence of oracles that perform progressively more complex computations, which cannot be performed by machines that incorporate oracles of lower power. Since a conventional Turing machine cannot solve the halting problem, a Turing machine with a halting problem oracle is evidently more powerful than a conventional Turing machine because the oracle can answer the halting question. It is straightforward to define an unsolvable halting problem for the augmented machine with the same method applied to the simpler halting problems that lead to the definition of a more capable oracle to solve that problem. This construction can be continued indefinitely, yielding an infinite set of conceptual machines that are progressively more powerful than a Turing machine. This builds the hierarchy of Turing degrees. Definition 2. The Turing degree of a subset A of natural numbers is the equivalence class consisting of all subsets of B equivalent to A under Turing reducibility. The degree of A is denoted by deg A. The least element in the partial order is denoted by 0 and the degree of all recursive sets, and this is the degree of all recursive sets, or computable sets. In other words, two sets of natural numbers have the same Turing degree when the question of whether a natural number belongs to one can be decided by a Turing machine having an oracle that can answer the question of whether the number belongs to the other and vice versa. So the Turing degree measures precisely the computability or incomputability degree of a subset X. Definition 3. A Turing reduction from an A to B is a reduction which easily computes A assuming B, i.e., A is computable by a Turing machine with an oracle for B. Because a language can be always codified by a subset of natural numbers, in terms of computability theory, sets and languages are equivalent. Definition 4. Formally, a language L is recognized by a Turing machine with an oracle A if for every string S, the machine using A as an oracle halts on input S if S belongs to the language L. A language B is Turing reducible to a language A if a Turing machine equipped with an oracle for A can decide B. Models for hypercomputation tend to be of two general types. One uses oracles or oracles in disguise, disguise, and the other uses infinite computation in finite time. Whether or not such machines are physically constructible, most experts believe they are not. Studying them improves our understanding of the recursion theory. On the other hand, neural networks have been studied as computational devices. In 1956, Klein showed how to simulate finite automata using McCulloch and Pitts neurons, and proved that when the weights of the networks are constrained to be integers, the languages accepted by them are exactly the regular languages. On the other hand, Minsky showed that neural networks with Boolean neurons can simulate any finite automaton. More recently, Hava Siegelman presented a computation model based on analog recurrent neural networks. All this work established a very strong connection between artificial neural networks and automata theory. Both automaton, including the Turing machine, and neural networks are characterized by the languages they accept and hold the same hierarchy. Siegelman offered a proof in which the set of languages accepted by networks with rational weights are exactly the recursively enumerable languages. Siegelman showed that analog recurrent neural networks are strictly more powerful than the Turing machine model, and that they can perform computations provably uncomputable by a universal Turing machine. Disregarding the fact that it seems unrealistic for most experts that those analog recurrent neural networks could be someday constructible, it is not easy to discard it if such devices are already present in nature, taking advantage on the physical properties of the universe, or at least the way in which they can perform computations over its physical environment. According to Kreisel himself, it is an open question whether there are any natural phenomena leading to an uncomputable number. Another interesting question raises by its own right, if there exists a natural device with such capabilities, how might we restrict to take advantages of the same physical properties in order to build an artificial equivalent device? Much of the defense of the work mentioned above have precisely centered on questions such as if we're taking advantage of the resources we have in nature. There are at least 3 important projects currently running: a Linux cluster running the MPI Neocortical Simulator (NCS), capable of simulating networks of thousands of spiking neurons and many millions of synapses, was launched by Phil Goodman and the University of Nevada. Blue Brain, a 4,000 processor IBM Blue Gene cluster, was used to simulate a brain in a project started in May 2005 in the Laboratory of Neural Microcircuitry of the Brain-Mind Institute at the EPFL in Lausanne, Switzerland, in collaboration with lab director Henri Markham. These neural networks satisfy some classical. According to G. Kreisel himself, it is an open question whether there are any natural phenomena leading to an uncomputable number. These neural networks satisfy some classical constraints of computational theory. The input, output, and transitions are discrete and finite. But the overall system is not really finite, since it uses arbitrary real numbers. And it is known that it is powerful enough to encode all non-recursively enumerable languages. Consequently, a connection between the complexity of the networks in terms of their information complexity and their computational power had been developed, spanning a hierarchy of computation from the Turing model to a super-Turing mathematical model. 2. Modeling the brain. A clear difference between the brain and a computer is that a digital computer operates by performing sequential instructions from an input program, whereas there is no clear analogy of such performance in the human brain. However, since any Turing machine working on several tapes is finally equivalent to a single tape Turing machine, the difference may be functional rather than fundamental. The brain as a fully parallel device could be reduced to a sequential input under some very significant restrictions, for example being discrete or finite. Nowadays, such questions are the subject of scientific and philosophical debates, since we have the computational resources to develop live experiments. However, digital computers were not designed to be models of the brain, even when they are running neural networks to simulate its behavior within their own computational restrictions. Most fundamental questions are, however, related to its computational power in both senses: time, space complexity, and degree of solvability. Most computational brain models programmed to date are in fact, strictly speaking, less powerful than a universal Turing machine. Researchers such as Stannett have speculated that if biological systems really do implement analog or quantum computation, or perhaps some mixture of the two, it is highly likely that they are provably more powerful computationally than Turing machines. This statement implies that true human intelligence cannot be implemented or supported by Turing machines, an opinion shared by Roger Penrose, who believes mechanical intelligence is impossible since purely physical processes are non-computable. A position strongly criticized by many researchers in the field, since its authors first propagated the idea. However, assuming some kind of relation between the mind and the brain's physical actions, neural networks may be accepted as a model of the human mind operation. Since such a mind-brain relation is widely accepted in different ways and levels, we concern ourselves with the computational power of these devices and the features that such networks must possess. We will address which, from our point of view, goes to the crux of the matter when the question of the computational power of the brain is raised, that is, its solvability degree. This means that we do not concern ourselves with what could be the recipe in which a simulation could run, since if we restrict ourselves to the discussion of artificial neural networks running on actual digital computers, we will be restricted to the lowest computational degree of solvability. From this, it can be easily deduced that if there is a fundamental difference between the architecture of the brain and digital computers, then the efforts of the artificial neural networks to fully simulate the brain either for the purpose of study or reproduction are destined to have fundamentally different degrees of power. Based on certain references as well as our own research, we have identified at least 5 mathematical descriptions in which super Turing capabilities have been formally captured: supertasks and accelerated Turing machines, while machines or Zeus machines, trial and error machines, non-standard quantum computation, and the analog recurrent neural networks. We have also identified other proposals concerning Turing machines with some kind of interaction between them or the environment. Those models provide a basis for the following claims. 1. Minds are not computers, because most thought processes are not. A. it can violate Gödel's theorem, therefore it is not a computing machine, a claim made most famously by Lucas in 1961. B. Mind can solve the Entscheidungsproblem. Therefore it is not a computing machine. 2. Minds are computing devices, but not of the same power of Turing machines. Maybe Gödel himself. In his 1951 Gibbs lecture, Gödel attempts to use incompleteness to reason about human intelligence. Gödel uses the incompleteness theorem to arrive at the following disjunction. Either mathematics is incompletable in this sense, that is, A. Either mathematics is completable in this sense, that its evident axioms cannot be compromised in a finite rule, that is to say, the human mind, even within the realm of pure mathematics, infinitely surpasses the power of any finite machine, or B. Or else there exist absolutely unsolvable Diophantine problems, or absolutely undecidable propositions for which it cannot decide whether solutions exist. Gödel finds B not plausible, and thus he seems to have believed that the human mind was not equivalent to a finite machine, i.e., its power exceeded that of any finite machine, the term used originally for Turing machines. Minds are computing devices, but not of the same power of Turing machines. And this was the position of maybe Gödel himself. There are special operations that occur in the brain which are not Turing computable, a claim made most famously by Penrose. B. The mind could be a machine, but with access to a certain oracle, from an external resource or from a previously called internal resource. All hypercomputational models presented to date are purely theoretical, and we may well ask whether they can actually be implemented in the sense that the universal Turing machine is implemented or pseudo-implemented in a common digital computer. A personal hypercomputer would be no more an implementation of a hypercomputational or hypercomputer model than a personal computer is of a universal Turing machine, and nobody has physically implemented any kind of hypercomputer. Most models seem to take advantage of A, a type of oracle device, or B, an infinite number of steps in a finite amount of time. Jack Copeland has pointed out an interesting fact concerning the way Turing machines work. He states that Turing machines are closed systems that do not accept input while operating, whereas the brain continually receives output from the environment. Based on this observation, Copeland has proposed a coupled Turing machine which is connected to the environment via one or more input channels. However, as Christoph Tucher and Moshe Sipper have pointed out, any coupled machine with a finite input stream can be simulated by a universal Turing machine, since the data can be written on the machine's tape before it begins operation. From dynamic systems, we often decide almost in an arbitrary way when a system will be closed in order to handle it. However, the chain of such external systems, potentially infinite, or even just by loops, can create a nonlinear system which could truly be more complex and maybe more powerful. Some other claims and critics have been made in this regard. Some other authors claim that a supermentalistic perspective is not a real scientific one, and it implies that the possibility of assigning non-reducible phenomena to some sort of information processing. However, we believe that this fact does not preclude a study of what formal properties can be required from non-Turing models of the human mind. A clarification of these properties would help us understand to what extent Super Turing models of the mind can or cannot be considered in a scientific way.